The first mistake was underestimating silence. The second, believing it was a sign of weakness. For the Xylosian Consensus, it would be the last. Their vast ancient empire, built on millennia of subtle coercion and outright conquest, had never encountered a force quite like the Terran Concord. They had navigated countless emerging species, brokering peace through calculated intimidation, offering terms that were, in truth, mandates. Their galactic dominion, the Xylosian Consensus, was not a cooperative union, but a web of enforced subservience, spun by the Kaelen, the dominant species, whose history stretched back to the first whispers of the hyperetheric drive. For cycles, the Kaelen had cultivated an image of immutable wisdom, their deep space probes meticulously charting every nascent civilization, categorizing them, predicting their trajectories. When the Terran Concord burst forth from the Sol system, it did not fit their models. There was no slow, predictable expansion. Instead, humanity surged, adapting, colonizing, and terraforming with an aggressive efficiency that defied the established galactic norms. They absorbed new technologies with unnerving speed, reverse engineering, Kaelen patented energy conduits, and warp-fold mechanics within cycles of first contact. They did not bow to the Consensus's economic overtures, nor did they flinch at their veiled threats. They simply built, expanded, and fortified. The Kaelen, accustomed to the delicate dance of galactic politics, initially dismissed humanity as a fleeting, chaotic anomaly. A species of violent, unpredictable curiosities, their internal memoranda concluded. They observed humanity's internal conflicts, their historical brutalities, and saw only a primal, unrefined species destined to consume itself. They failed to grasp the underlying resilience, the cold, adaptive logic that forged unity from discord. They mistook humanity's past for its future. It was this fundamental miscalculation that led to the Conclave of Theron, not a summit of equals, but a formal summoning. The Xylosian Consensus, weary of humanity's persistent refusal to integrate into their structured order, decided it was time for a public display of dominance. The Kaelen, along with their client species, the multi-limbed, bureaucratic Thrakar and the ethereal, psionic Solani, convened the assembly. The message was clear. Humanity would be brought to heel, either through acquiescence or through a carefully orchestrated humiliation designed to shatter their nascent confidence. The conclave chamber on Theron Prime was an architectural marvel of polished obsidian and crystalline light veins designed to overawe. The central platform, where the Kaelen High Speaker, Vorlag, presided, floated above a tiered amphitheater where delegates from over 200 starfaring species were arrayed. Each species, distinct in form and custom, shared a common thread, their submission, willing or otherwise, to the Consensus. Into this meticulously choreographed display, the Terran delegation entered. They were few, deliberately so. 3 human figures, unadorned in their stark, dark Concord-issued diplomatic uniforms. No elaborate regalia, no ceremonial weapons, no entourage. Their expressions were neutral, their posture erect. They carried themselves with a quiet gravity that, to the Kaelen, seemed like a defiant lack of respect for the grandeur of the chamber. To the Solani, however, sensitive to the emotional spectrum, the human delegation projected an unnerving void, a calculated absence of fear or awe. High Speaker Vorlag, a towering Kaelen with eyes that glowed with an internal calculating light, initiated the proceedings. His voice, translated universally into the mind of every delegate, was a low, resonant thrum of ancient authority. He spoke of galactic order, of the delicate balance maintained by the Consensus, of the responsibilities of mature civilizations. Then, his gaze, sharp and unblinking, fixed upon the Terran delegates. The Terran Concord, Vorlag began, his tone shifting, represents a unique challenge to the established harmony. A species only recently emerged from its cradle world, exhibiting volatile tendencies, a history of self-inflicted wounds, and an unsettling disregard for the principles of universal stewardship. He paused, allowing his words to echo through the vast chamber. The murmurs from the other species were carefully modulated, but the underlying sentiment was clear: agreement. The insults began subtly, then escalated. The Thrakar ambassador, its multiple manipulators gesturing emphatically, detailed humanity's inefficient resource consumption and uncontrolled population expansion. The Solani emissary, its form shimmering with psionic energy, spoke of humanity's unstable emotional core and propensity for irrational violence. Each condemnation was delivered with the detached air of a clinical diagnosis, not a political attack. The goal was to strip humanity of dignity, to label them a galactic pariah, too dangerous and too primitive to be allowed to operate outside the consensus's direct oversight. The humans remained silent, their faces unreadable, their eyes fixed forward. They absorbed every word, every insult, every calculated slight. The chamber watched, expectant, for a reaction. There was none. Finally, Vorlag leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper that nonetheless reverberated with amplified contempt. "Your homeworld, Sol 3, which you call Earth," he pronounced the name with a sneer, "is not a testament to evolutionary success. It is a violent experiment gone wrong. A feral laboratory where chaos reigns supreme, and your species, its most virulent byproduct, threatens to infect the wider cosmos." The words hung in the air, a final, definitive declaration of humanity's perceived inferiority. The human delegates stood motionless, their silence profound, their faces utterly devoid of emotion. This was not a negotiation, this was an indictment, and the verdict, it seemed, was already delivered. A profound, suffocating silence descended upon the conclave chamber. The Kaelen High Speaker, Vorlag, observed the Terran delegates with a predatory satisfaction. Their unmoving posture, their unblinking gaze, to his species, these were signs of profound shock, of a primitive intellect overwhelmed by superior wisdom and unassailable truth. The Thrakar ambassador, its mandibles clicking softly, registered the lack of a human response as definitive capitulation. The Solani emissary, probing the psychic landscape, detected only a flat, unreadable surface, a void where fear or indignation should have been. They mistook a disciplined absence of reaction for a species broken. What they perceived as emptiness was, in fact, a hyper-focused state of operational readiness. The three human delegates, Ambassador Kaelen Thorne, Security Attaché Major Eris Volkov, and Strategic Analyst Dr. Elara Vance, were not processing insult. They were processing data, every word spoken by Vorlag, every subtle shift in the Solani's psionic emanations, every dismissive gesture from the Thrakar was a data point. Their mission parameters had been clear: observe, endure, and confirm the consensus's intent. The Kaelen had just confirmed it with brutal clarity. The diplomatic phase was over. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor passed through the chamber as Vorlag concluded his summation. "The Terran Concord," he intoned, "will be granted a standard cycle to consider the consensus's offer of integration and oversight. Refusal will necessitate alternative measures." He expected a plea, a protest, perhaps even a desperate attempt at negotiation. Instead, Ambassador Thorne performed a precise, almost robotic pivot. Major Volkov and Dr. Vance mirrored the movement with synchronous precision. No bow, no nod, no verbal acknowledgement. Just a measured turn and a silent, deliberate exit. Their boots made no sound on the polished obsidian floor. They walked with the controlled, economical strides of individuals whose every movement was calculated, every energy expenditure optimized. The other species watched, a ripple of unease finally spreading through the chamber. This was not the broken submission they had anticipated. This was something else, something cold. Within moments, the Terran shuttle, the Dake Vanguard Ascendant, detached from the orbital docking spire of Theron Prime. Its comm systems, previously locked down to prevent any premature data leaks, flared to life, sending a burst packet transmission on a secure, hyper-encoded channel back to the Sol system. The message was succinct, containing a single alphanumeric string, Conclave Red. Protocol Iron silence initiated. Half a light-year away, within the deeply shielded command caverns beneath the Martian moon Phobos, the message was received. The primary command center, designated Aegis Prime, was a stark, functional space of reinforced plasteel and flickering holographic displays. Here, General Theron Kael, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles, stood before a vast tactical projection of the Xylosian Consensus's frontier. Beside him, Fleet Admiral Anya Sharma, her gaze like chipped ice, monitored the inbound data. "Conclave red," General Kael stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "Confirmation received. The consensus has chosen its path." Operation Iron Silence. All elements, execute Phase 1. Synchronized strike packages. No deviations, no warnings. This was not a reaction born of a sudden insult. This was the culmination of years of meticulous intelligence gathering, of predictive modeling, of wargaming every conceivable scenario. Humanity had understood, from their very first contact with the Xylosian probes, that the consensus did not seek equals. They sought tributaries. The Conclave of Theron was merely the final confirmation, the trigger point for a pre-planned, devastating response. The diplomatic mission had been a sophisticated reconnaissance in force, designed to bait the consensus into revealing the full extent of their arrogance and their strategic vulnerabilities. Across the sprawling expanse of the Terran Concord sphere of influence, dormant fleet assets stirred. Not the massive, easily detectable battle fleets, but ghost ships, cloaked vessels of the Concord's Blacklight Initiative, designed for deep space penetration and surgical strikes. These were the Wraiths, the Spectres, the Reapers, destroyers and frigates modified for silent running and equipped with experimental void torpedo arrays and kinetic energy projectors capable of delivering multi-gigaton payloads. They had been positioned months ago, hidden in asteroid fields, nestled within nebulae, or masquerading as civilian freighters on established trade routes. The Xylosian Consensus maintained 9 primary forward bases along their frontier with Terran space. These were not heavily fortified star fortresses, but logistical hubs, communication relays, and staging points for projected expansion. The Kaelen, confident in their diplomatic leverage and the perceived weakness of the Terrans, had deemed them sufficient. They were the visible teeth of the consensus, designed to project authority, not to withstand a coordinated, unannounced assault from a species they considered primitive. A digital countdown timer, displayed in stark red on Aegis Prime's central console, began its final minute. T-minus 60 seconds to strike vector initialization, a calm, synthesized voice announced. General Kael surveyed the projected targets. 9 green markers, each representing a consensus forward base: Citadel Gamma, Omen's Reach, Vorlag Spire, Coercion Station, the Velez Array, the Solani Nexus, Thrakar Outpost 7, the Kaelen Vigil, and the distant orbital shipyards of the Xylosian's primary logistics hub, Deep Core Sigma. Each location represented a critical node in the consensus's frontier network. The destruction of anyone would be a severe blow. The simultaneous destruction of all 9 would be an act of strategic decapitation, an unprecedented display of unified, overwhelming force. The Kaelen, still basking in their perceived diplomatic victory, remained blissfully unaware. They were celebrating the silence they had imposed, not realizing it was the silence before the storm. The digital countdown on Aegis Prime's central console reached 0. A silent green light pulsed once, then vanished. There was no fanfare, no shouted commands, only the soft hum of cooling systems and the faint rhythmic data flow across the vast holographic displays. General Kael and Admiral Sharma remained motionless, their gazes fixed on the 9 designated target markers, which now glowed a dangerous, pulsating red. The silence in the command center was absolute, a testament to the discipline forged in the crucible of a species that had learned to wage war with surgical precision. Across hundreds of thousands of light-years, the Terran strike packages executed their final vectors. The Wraith-class stealth frigates, each a needle of dark alloy and cloaked energy, dropped their deep void shrouds simultaneously. Their targets, the Xylosian forward bases, were caught utterly unaware. These outposts, designed for passive surveillance and light logistics, had no defensive protocols for a coordinated, silent running assault. Their primary sensors, calibrated for the predictable energy signatures of established consensus vessels, registered nothing until the last, fatal microsecond. The first volley was delivered by the Spectre-class destroyers, not conventional ordnance, but kinetic energy projectiles, dense slugs of hypercompressed osmium accelerated to a terrifying fraction of light speed. These were not designed to explode, but to disintegrate. Their impact against the shields of Citadel Gamma was not a flash, but a silent implosion, a localized collapse of space-time as the energy was transferred. The base, a sprawling orbital complex of habitat modules and docking bays, simply ceased to exist, collapsing inward upon itself, leaving behind only an expanding cloud of superheated plasma and vaporized debris. Almost instantaneously, across the frontier, the same horrific silence played out. At Omen's Reach, a Reaper-class heavy frigate unleashed a volley of void torpedoes. These were not warheads, but localized gravity wells, designed to tear the fabric of space. The station, a strategically vital comms relay, twisted and folded in on itself, its plasteel and composite alloys shrieking silently as they were crushed into an impossible singularity, then dispersed into a brief, violent nova of released energy. On the orbital shipyards of Deep Core Sigma, the Xylosians' primary logistics hub, the attack was even more devastating. Multiple wraiths engaged, their focused particle beams lancing out with cold, surgical precision. The shipyards, filled with vessels undergoing repair or refit, were bisected, the reactors detonating in chain reactions that tore the massive structures apart. The explosions were not chaotic, but controlled, contained by the void shields of the attacking Terran vessels, preventing stray energy from alerting distant consensus patrols. The resulting debris cloud was immense, but silent, a testament to the ruthlessness of the assault. Within a mere 57 seconds of the countdown hitting zero, all 9 Xylosian forward bases had been eliminated. No distress calls had been sent, no defensive countermeasures had been activated, there was no heroic last stand, no desperate plea for aid. There was only the sudden, absolute void where complex structures had once existed. The consensus, with all its ancient wisdom and technological might, had been struck blind and deaf on its own frontier. Back on Theron Prime, the Kaelen High Speaker, Vorlag, was still holding court, regaling his fellow delegates with the nuances of their diplomatic victory. He was discussing the terms of integration for the Terrans, the subtle ways they would be made to understand their subservient role. The Thrakar ambassador was already drafting the formal decree, its multiple manipulators clicking contentedly. The Solani emissary was projecting an aura of smug satisfaction, certain that the Terrans had been psychically cowed. Then, a low, urgent murmur began to ripple through the chamber. A minor Kaelen data scribe, usually a picture of stoic composure, was frantically gesturing to a senior aide. The aide's glowing eyes widened in disbelief. Within moments, the murmur escalated into a cacophony of confused shouts and alarm signals. Tactical displays across the chamber, usually filled with placid star charts and trade routes, flickered into stark red alert. High Speaker. An agitated Kaelen communications officer blurted out, breaking all protocol. Multiple strategic nodes, dark. Citadel Gamma, Omen's Reach, Vorlag Spire, all offline. No trace, no energy signature. They just vanished. Vorlag's smug expression dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His internal calculating light flickered wildly. Impossible. He roared, his voice betraying a raw primal fear. These are secure installations. They cannot simply vanish. But they had. The tactical displays now showed 9 gaping voids where, less than a minute ago, the consensus's frontier had been firmly established. The silence from the Terran delegation had not been the silence of submission. It had been the silence of a coiled viper calculating its strike. The Kaelen, for the first time in millennia, experienced true strategic bewilderment. Their carefully constructed reality, their understanding of galactic power dynamics, had just been vaporized along with their forward bases. The violent experiment gone wrong had just demonstrated a level of coordinated, devastating force that rewrote every known parameter of warfare. On Aegis Prime, General Kael watched the final target marker turn from red to black on the tactical display. Admiral Sharma closed the command channel. Operation Iron Silence complete. All strike elements reporting full mission success and disengagement to pre-designated deep void rendezvous points. No Terran losses, no detection beyond initial strike radius. General Kael nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction playing on his lips. The message has been delivered, he stated, his voice a low rumble. We don't bark, we bite. Once. The Kaelen High Speaker, Vorlag, initially paralyzed by shock, now paced the central platform of the conclave chamber, his glowing eyes flickering erratically, a sure sign of extreme distress for his species. His usually resonant voice was a strained rasp as he barked orders, none of which brought clarity. Status reports. Re-establish contact. Send probes. What is the meaning of this? The Consensus's galactic network, a vast web of communication relays and sensor arrays, was a testament to their millennia of dominance. Yet, it offered no explanation. There were no residual energy signatures, no debris fields that indicated a conventional attack. The data feeds were simply flatlined, the target zones showing as empty space. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been surgically excised. The Solani emissary, its psionic senses reaching out, recoiled in psychic horror. There was no lingering psychic echo of death or destruction, just a cold, terrifying emptiness. The suddenness, the totality of the obliteration, defied every known parameter of warfare. Emergency conclaves were convened across the Xylosian Consensus. From the Kaelen capital world of Xylos Prime to the farthest client species homeworlds, the news spread like a contagion of terror. The Consensus's military strategists, their faces etched with disbelief, reviewed the sparse data available. The Terrans had achieved the impossible, a simultaneous, silent, perfectly synchronized decapitation strike against heavily monitored frontier installations, leaving no trace, no survivors, and no warning. Their intelligence assessments, which had labeled humanity as volatile but technologically nascent, were not merely wrong. They were catastrophically, fatally wrong. Admiral Throkar, Cathar, the Consensus's Supreme Fleet Commander, a being whose entire existence was predicated on logical analysis and overwhelming force projection, sat in stunned silence. He understood war. But this was not war as he knew it. This was an act of surgical eradication, a demonstration of power so precise it felt alien, almost divine. The cold, unreadable silence of the Terran delegates in the conclave chamber now replayed in his mind, not as submission, but as the chilling calm before predators pounce. The Xylosian Consensus, built on an intricate foundation of perceived invincibility and a carefully cultivated image of benevolent superiority, began to crack under the sudden brutal pressure. Client species, previously compliant, watched with a dawning terror and a strange, nascent hope. The species that had dared to defy the Consensus, the violent experiment gone wrong, had not only survived the Kaelen's diplomatic insults, but had responded with an act of such cold, devastating efficiency that it sent shivers down the spine of the entire galaxy. The message was clear, though unspoken. The Terran Concord was not to be trifled with. Their silence was not weakness. It was a prelude to an unstoppable force. Meanwhile, back in the Sol system, the Terran Concord maintained its absolute silence. No celebratory communiques, no grand declarations of victory. Aegis Prime remained a hub of quiet, focused activity. General Kael and Admiral Sharma simply observed the unfolding chaos on the Consensus's networks. The intelligence streams, now flowing freely from the Xylosian systems, painted a picture of utter disarray. The Kaelen were scrambling, desperately trying to understand what had just happened. They were reacting exactly as predicted, with shock, confusion, and a frantic attempt to re-establish a defensive perimeter that no longer existed. The three delegates disembarked, their faces still neutral, their mission accomplished. They had delivered the final insult, the diplomatic bait, and the Consensus had swallowed it whole. The Iron Silence was not just the name of the operation, it was the Terran Concord's new strategic doctrine. No threats, no warnings, no negotiations, just overwhelming, decisive action. The galactic community, previously dismissive or fearful of the Terrans, was now forced to recalculate. News of the Nine vanished, spread through subspace relays and encrypted channels, whispered from one species to another. The Kaelen's carefully constructed image of unassailable authority had been shattered in less than a minute. Humanity, the species they had mocked as primitive and chaotic, had just demonstrated a level of unified technological prowess that made the Consensus's ancient fleets seem cumbersome and slow. The Xylosian frontier, once a firm line of control, was now a gaping void. Their primary logistics hub, Deep Core Sigma, was gone. Their communication relays, their forward observation posts, all vaporized. The strategic implications were staggering. The Terran Concord had not just won a battle, they had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the known galaxy. The violent experiment had just become the most formidable and most terrifying force in the cosmos, and they had done it without a single word. The universe had heard their silence. The ripple effect of Operation Iron's silence was not a crashing wave, but a silent, pervasive tide of dread that swept through the Xylosian Consensus. Their once unquestioned authority, built on centuries of calculated intimidation, had been shattered by an invisible hammer. The Kaelen, the architects of this galactic order, found their carefully constructed edifice of power crumbling under the weight of an unprecedented strategic defeat. Their intelligence agencies, previously deemed infallible, were now revealed as fatally blind. Their military, considered indomitable, was shown to be utterly vulnerable to a force it could neither detect nor comprehend. Admiral Thrakar Cathar, the Supreme Fleet Commander, ordered a full system-wide lockdown of all consensus-aligned space. Fleets that had been leisurely patrolling their sectors were recalled to defensive postures around core worlds. Strategic assets, previously dispersed, were consolidated, creating a chaotic snarl of vessels trying to establish a coherent defensive perimeter. But against what? The Terrans had left no trace, no lingering energy signatures, no identifiable fleet movements. It was like trying to defend against a ghost that had already struck. The Kaelen High Council, traditionally a bastion of calm, calculating authority, descended into acrimonious debate. Accusations flew, old rivalries flared, and the veneer of unity began to crack. Some argued for immediate, overwhelming retaliation, a demonstration of force to restore their damaged prestige. Others, the more pragmatic and deeply shaken, argued for caution, for intelligence gathering, for understanding the nature of this new, terrifying threat. They understood that to strike blindly might invite an even more devastating response. The Xylosian Consensus had always been a predator. Now, for the first time, it felt like prey. The Solani emissary, once so confident in its psionic assessments of humanity, now projected an aura of profound disquiet. Its probes into the Terran psychic landscape, previously dismissed as an unstable emotional core, now revealed a chilling unity, a deep-seated resolve that defied their understanding of individualistic species. The collective human consciousness, when focused, was not chaotic but a single, unyielding will, an iron silence that resonated with terrifying power. The emissary reported a complete inability to glean any further strategic intent from the Terrans, only an impenetrable wall of calm, resolute focus. This was a species that did not telegraph its intentions, it simply acted. The client species within the consensus reacted with a complex mix of fear and dawning hope. For generations, they had chafed under Kaelen dominance, their economies exploited, their cultures suppressed. Now, a new power had emerged, a species that had defied the consensus with an act of devastating clarity. Whispers began to circulate, hushed discussions of opportunity, of the possibility of shifting allegiances. The Kaelen's grip on their vast empire had been predicated on their perceived invincibility. That perception had just been vaporized. For the Terran Concord, the days following Operation Iron Silence were marked not by celebration, but by methodical consolidation. Aegis Prime continued its silent vigil. General Kael oversaw the redeployment of the strike forces, their cloaked vessels melting back into the deep void, disappearing as swiftly and silently as they had appeared. Admiral Sharma, with surgical precision, began to analyze the Xylosian Consensus's panic, charting their desperate defensive maneuvers, their internal squabbles, their attempts to understand the incomprehensible. No official communique was sent from the Terran Concord. No demands were made. No conditions were laid out. The silence from Sol was absolute. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a chilling void that forced the consensus to confront its own vulnerabilities. The message, delivered by kinetic impact and void torpedo, was being absorbed slowly and painfully by every species in the galaxy. The Kaelen, in their desperation, initiated their own deep space probes, attempting to detect the Terran vessels, to locate their hidden bases, to find anything. Their advanced sensor arrays, capable of detecting minute energy fluctuations across vast distances, returned nothing but the cold, empty vacuum of space. The Terran Concord had vanished as completely as their targets. It was a psychological weapon as potent as any warhead. The unknown was always more terrifying than the known. The diplomatic insults of the Conclave of Theron now seemed utterly insignificant, a foolish prelude to a strategic reckoning. The Kaelen had declared humanity a violent experiment gone wrong, a feral laboratory. Humanity had responded by showing them what a truly controlled experiment in violence looked like. The lesson was brutal, unequivocal, and delivered with a chilling elegance that redefined the meaning of force. The universe, holding its breath, waited for humanity's next move, dreading it, yet unable to look away. But humanity, in its iron silence, offered no further clues, only the lingering phantom of 9 vanished bases. The Xylosian Consensus, accustomed to the predictable rhythms of conquest and assimilation, found itself adrift in an ocean of terrifying uncertainty. Their vast intelligence apparatus, once a source of unshakable confidence, now yielded nothing but static and conflicting theories. Some Kaelen strategists posited a rogue Terran faction operating outside the Concord's official command structure. Others whispered of a singular, devastating superweapon deployed once and then withdrawn. But the most unsettling theory, gaining traction amongst the traumatized Solani emissaries, was that humanity itself, in its collective, unified will, was the weapon, a species capable of such disciplined, silent, and devastating force. Vorlag, the High Speaker, now faced open challenges to his authority. His reputation, once unassailable, was now synonymous with the disastrous Conclave of Theron and the subsequent, inexplicable obliteration of their frontier. The calls for immediate, overwhelming retaliation grew louder from some factions, fueled by wounded pride and a desperate need to reassert dominance. But these calls were met with cold, hard logic from others. How do you retaliate against a ghost? What target do you strike when the enemy has left no trace? Admiral Thrakar, K-Star, the Supreme Fleet Commander, despite the chaos, maintained a chilling pragmatism. He had ordered the largest redeployment of consensus assets in centuries, consolidating their vast fleets around core worlds, establishing deep space sensor nets, and initiating round-the-clock patrol routes. Yet, even with these measures, a pervasive sense of vulnerability permeated the command decks. Every flicker on a sensor screen, every anomalous energy signature sent a jolt of fear through his crews. The Terrans had demonstrated that their concept of force transcended mere numbers or conventional power. It was about precision, surprise, and absolute, devastating efficiency. Across the galaxy, the news of the 9 vanished continued to propagate, amplified by subspace channels and the terrified whispers of merchant fleets. The client species of the Xylosian Consensus, who had long endured the Kaelen's heavy hand, began to stir. Centuries of resentment, previously suppressed by the Kaelen's overwhelming power, now found fertile ground. The Iron Silence AKC had not only shattered the Kaelen's physical frontier, but also the psychological barrier of their invincibility. Covert communications, previously unthinkable, began to flow between species, discussing the implications of this new, terrifying yet strangely liberating force. The galactic order, once immutable, was now in flux. From the Terran Concord, there remained only the profound, unnerving silence. No diplomatic overtures, no demands for reparations, no triumphal proclamations. Aegis Prime continued its watch, its vast databanks absorbing every scrap of intelligence from the reeling consensus. General Kael and Admiral Sharma meticulously analyzed the Kaelen's desperate countermeasures, their internal political struggles, and the dawning realization of their client species. This was not merely a military victory, it was a strategic masterstroke designed to destabilize an entire empire without firing another shot. The message had been delivered, and its echoes were reverberating through the very foundations of the consensus. The Kaelen, in their desperation, dispatched their most advanced deep space reconnaissance vessels, the four more frontier territories, into the former frontier territories. These probes, equipped with multi-spectrum gravimetric sensors and quantum-entangled comms, were designed to detect even the faintest residual energy signatures, the minutest distortions in space-time. They found nothing. Only the silent, empty void where bases and shipyards had once stood. The cold, unyielding precision of the Terran strike was a phantom limb, an amputation so clean it left no scar. Their scientific minds, previously dismissive of human ingenuity, now scrambled to reverse engineer any shred of data they could find. They reviewed historical records of Terran conflicts, seeking patterns, seeking weaknesses. They found only a history of brutal internal struggle, yes, but also a chilling adaptability, a relentless drive to overcome. They had mistaken humanity's past for its destiny. Humanity had learned from its violent experiments, distilled the chaos into a honed, surgical instrument. The Xylosian Consensus, for the first time in millennia, found itself on the defensive, not against a rival empire, but against an unknown, unseen force that had demonstrated an unparalleled capacity for silent, devastating violence. The insults hurled at the Conclave of Theron now tasted like ash in Vorlag's mouth, a violent experiment gone wrong. Indeed, and now that experiment had perfected its methodology, and the consensus was its unwilling subject. The silence from Sol was not an absence of sound, it was the deafening roar of a predator that had just shown its teeth, and was now patiently waiting for the prey to make its next fatal move. The universe was learning that some forces did not need to boast. They simply were. The Xylosian Consensus, a galactic empire built on the bedrock of information control and strategic foresight, now found itself navigating a void of terrifying unknowns. The iron silence from the Terran Concord was not merely the absence of communication, it was a deliberate, active weapon. It forced the Kaelen to speculate, to fear, to exhaust their vast resources in a futile attempt to anticipate an enemy that refused to reveal its next move. Every Kaelen intelligence report, every Solani psychic probe, every Thrakar logistical analysis came back with the same conclusion. Humanity was an enigma, a perfectly calibrated instrument of force that had demonstrated its capability and then simply waited. High Speaker Vorlag, once the epitome of Kaelen composure, was now a fractured figure. His glowing eyes, usually a steady beacon of authority, flickered with uncontrolled anxiety. The conclave chamber, once the stage for his diplomatic triumph, was now a constant reminder of his catastrophic misjudgment. The very insult he had hurled, a violent experiment gone wrong, now echoed as a chilling prophecy. Humanity was an experiment, but one that had refined its methods to a terrifying degree. The Kaelen's military doctrine, honed over millennia of predictable conflicts, was utterly unprepared for an adversary that did not conform to established patterns. They understood overwhelming force, prolonged sieges, and calculated attrition. They did not understand a surgical strike that vanished without a trace, followed by an absolute strategic silence. It defied their logic, it defied their very understanding of war. The silence was louder than any declaration of war, more terrifying than any threat. It implied an infinite patience, a boundless capacity for calculated devastation. Desperate to break the Terran silence, the Kaelen High Council initiated a series of unprecedented actions. They dispatched diplomatic envoys to neutral species, probing for any contact, any information, any hint of Terran intent. The response was universal. The Terran Concord was silent. They offered no explanations, no demands. This unnerved the Kaelen more than any direct threat. What did a species want if not territory, resources, or political concession? What was their endgame? The lack of a clear objective was, in itself, a terrifying objective. Admiral Cathar, abandoning traditional defensive strategies, ordered the construction of massive, deep void sensor arrays extending far beyond the traditional consensus borders. These Sentinel Nexus stations were designed to detect even the faintest warp signatures, the most minute gravimetric fluctuations, hoping to catch any whisper of Terran fleet movement. Yet, they too found only the vast empty canvas of space. The Terrans were either too advanced to detect, or they were simply not moving. Both possibilities were equally terrifying. The internal unrest within the consensus deepened. The client species, emboldened by the Kaelen's evident vulnerability, began to assert themselves. The Thrakar, usually subservient, started delaying resource shipments to Kaelen core worlds, citing unforeseen logistical complications. The Solani, whose psionic insights were crucial to Kaelen intelligence, became increasingly evasive, their communal consciousness turning inward, protecting their own interests. The Kaelen's iron grip, once unyielding, was now a tremor. The Empire was not yet collapsing, but it was certainly fracturing. From the quiet command centers of Aegis Prime, General Kael and Admiral Sharma observed the unfolding chaos with grim satisfaction. The intelligence streams, now a flood from the fractured consensus, detailed their internal struggles, their growing paranoia, their desperate attempts to reassert control. The iron silence was achieving its objective. The Kaelen were consuming themselves, their own fear and uncertainty doing more damage than any further kinetic strike could have. The Terran Concord's position was clear. They had demonstrated their capacity for overwhelming force, not as a threat, but as a definitive statement. They would not be insulted, they would not be coerced, and they would not engage in endless, fruitless negotiations. Their actions spoke louder than any words. The universe had been forced to recalculate. Humanity, once a curiosity, then a nuisance, was now recognized as an apex predator, a force of nature that struck with chilling precision and then receded, leaving only the terrifying memory of its power. The Kaelen, in their desperation, finally made a move that surprised even the Terrans. They attempted to initiate direct, one-way communications towards the Sol system, pleading for a response, any response. Their messages were filled with carefully worded apologies, veiled offers of concessions, and desperate pleas for understanding. They used every known diplomatic protocol, every form of address, but the Terran Concord remained silent. Their comms arrays, capable of receiving every frequency, every quantum-entangled burst, simply absorbed the Kaelen's desperate pleas without acknowledgement. It was a final, devastating insult, delivered not by words but by the cold, absolute void of non-response. The Kaelen had tried to humiliate humanity with words. Humanity replied with the silence of utter contempt, a silence that promised unimaginable consequences for any further provocation. The stage was set for the universe to learn the final, terrifying lesson of the iron silence. The universe held its breath. For cycles, the Xylosian Consensus, once the undisputed hegemon of the known galaxy, had spiraled into a vortex of fear and paralysis. The iron silence from the Terran Concord was not merely a tactic, it was a psychological weapon precisely engineered to dismantle their empire from within. Every Kaelen attempt to provoke a response, to elicit a demand, to even provoke a threat, met with the same impenetrable void. Humanity had shown its teeth, then simply waited, allowing the consensus to bleed from its own self-inflicted wounds of paranoia and internal strife. High Speaker Vorlag, once the architect of galactic order, now resided in a self-imposed isolation, his once glowing eyes dulled by a profound, existential weariness. The Conclave of Theron, the stage for his arrogant pronouncements, had become a monument to his species' catastrophic hubris. The violent experiment gone wrong had not only survived but had turned the very concept of wrong into a terrifying new form of right. Humanity had distilled its chaotic past into a ruthless, precise future. The Kaelen military, under Admiral Cathar, continued its desperate attempts to secure its borders, but the morale of its fleets was shattered. Every phantom blip on a sensor screen, every unconfirmed energy spike sent ripples of terror through their command decks. The concept of an enemy that could strike with absolute precision and then vanish without a trace was anathema to their tactical doctrine. They were defending against a phantom, and the stress was tearing their forces apart. The client species, witnessing the Kaelen's descent into disarray, began to openly defy their former masters. Resource shipments ceased. Diplomatic ties were severed. Small, independent defense pacts formed on the periphery of the consensus, their leaders looking with a new, cautious respect towards the silent power of Sol. The Xylosian Consensus was not merely fractured, it was dissolving, its centuries-old dominion eroding under the relentless pressure of a single unspoken message. It was the Silani emissary, its psionic senses attuned to the deepest currents of collective consciousness, that finally articulated the terrifying truth to the Kaelen High Council. The emissary, its form shimmering with a newfound gravity, projected a single, chilling image into the minds of the assembled Kaelen, not of a roaring beast, but of a perfectly still, perfectly balanced hunter, its eyes unblinking, its posture ready. They do not bark, the emissary's collective thought resonated, because they do not need to. Their bark is the sudden, absolute cessation of existence. They did not threaten, they acted. They did not demand, they demonstrated. Their silence is not a void, it is a promise. A promise that any further provocation will be met, not with diplomacy, not with negotiation, but with a final, unchallengeable force. The diplomatic insults had not been a test of humanity's resolve. They had been a test of the Xylosian Consensus's capacity for self-destruction, and the consensus had failed. Humanity's response was not an act of war in the conventional sense. It was a brutal, definitive re-education. The message was not, "We will defeat you." It was, "We are unbeatable, and we will tolerate no challenge to our sovereign space." From Aegis Prime, General Kael and Admiral Sharma watched the final, desperate implosion of the Xylosian Consensus's will. The constant barrage of Kaelen comms, once pleading, now ceased altogether. The strategic data streams, once detailing panicked defensive maneuvers, now showed a resigned, almost defeated stillness across former consensus space. The galaxy was not waiting for humanity's next move, it was adapting to its new reality. The Terran Concord remained a bastion of quiet, focused strength. There were no victory parades, no monuments erected to Operation Iron Silence. The message had been delivered, and its profound impact was its own monument. Humanity had not sought to conquer. It had sought to secure its place, irrevocably and definitively. It had not boasted its power. It had simply shown it. The universe, in the aftermath, recalculated. Humanity, once dismissed as a chaotic anomaly, was now understood as a force of unparalleled discipline and devastating capability. Their unity, forged in the crucible of their own violent history, was not a weakness, but an unyielding core of steel resolve. The violent experiment had indeed gone wrong for the Xylosian Consensus, but for humanity, it had gone perfectly, brutally right. The Conclave of Theron became a galactic fable, a chilling cautionary tale whispered across star systems. It was the story of an ancient empire that tried to humiliate a nascent species with words and was met not with a counter-argument, but with an unstoppable force that redefined the very meaning of power. And the enduring lesson, etched into the collective consciousness of the cosmos, was this. When humanity went silent, it was not because they had nothing to say, it was because they were about to speak with a language of pure, unadulterated consequence. And that language, once heard, could never be forgotten.